Well, thank you very much, everybody, for coming tonight. We're really excited about the program. My name is Lori Olinger, and I'm with Northeast Metro Climate Action. We're a volunteer community group that we cover the Northeast Metro area, which is like Shoreview, North Oaks, White Bear Lake, Vadnais Heights, and Matamidi. And we're always looking for new members. So if you're interested in joining us, we'd love to have you. We do monthly events for the community on climate-related topics. Last month, we had one on electric vehicles, and next month, we have one on May 31st, and it's Eating for a Healthy Planet, and it's going to be at the Shoreview Library at 6:30 to 7:30, and then we'll have a hopefully, a food truck there that you'll be able to get some food beforehand. So that's coming up for our May meeting. And we also engage with legislators and community leaders on climate-related topics. And our co-hosts tonight, we want to thank them. Resilient Roseville, Vote Climate, West Metro Climate Action, Indivisible North Metro Environment Team, and the St. Croix Valley Indivisible Climate Justice Team. So thank you very much for co-hosting with us tonight. We also want to acknowledge that we meet on the traditional lands of the Dakota and Ojibwe people. And tonight we're just very excited to have two panelists with us, Mary Kosuth and Lucy Mullany. We really appreciate you coming and joining us tonight. I hope everybody had a chance to watch The Story of Plastic, which is really a powerful movie, so informational and difficult to watch in many ways, but just really a lot of really good information. So I hope you had a chance to watch that. And Mary and Lucy are both going to give short presentations, then we'll still have plenty of time for questions after that. So Mary Kosuth is finishing her PhD with the University of Minnesota, and she's doing research on microplastics. And Lucy Mullany is the Director of Policy and Advocacy with Eureka Recycling. And before coming to Eureka, Lucy was a leading advocate for economic justice and financial security policy at federal, state, and local levels. So we're really happy to have both of you here tonight. Mary, do you want to start off with your presentation?
Sure. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yep.
Awesome. Well, I am a little embarrassed to admit it, but the link that you sent out so that we could watch the video is actually the first time I've ever seen the film, but I've heard a lot about it, and I was just like, the whole time I was like, yeah, of course, because it just pulled together like so many things that thoughts that I've had, I guess, in the last 7 years that I've been doing this. So I am approaching this issue from a public health perspective. As Lori said, I'm a graduate student from the School of Public Health in the Environmental Health Sciences Division, and I study microplastic pollution. So my research is around the fate and transport of contaminant particles, and by that I mean I'm working to understand how contaminant particles move in bulk through the environment. What is it about their shape and size and density that makes them stay put or move on? What environmental conditions cause particles to settle versus remain aloft? Right now, if we were to go to the Arctic and pull a bunch of 10-micron plastic bits from an ice floe, we wouldn't know if it came from the air or ocean. So there's a lot of questions that remain about microplastic fate and transport. And really, we need to know how far it can travel and what the global pathways it uses are if we're going to effectively regulate it. So that's my dissertation work, but I'm personally very interested in environmental justice issues associated with plastic. When I complete this program, I hope to carry out exposure studies in the Global South. That's kind of my dream job. And if you've seen the film, The Story of Plastic, they really center the Global South in its reporting. And according to one publication, the top 10 nations that publish microplastic research are listed here, and most of them, as you can see, are in the developed world. So the TNP stands for total number of publications. That's on the column on the far right. So you can see that China leads and the US is second. And other than Australia and Canada, all the other nations are in Europe. So clearly more studies need to happen in, they currently happen in the developed world, but they're badly needed, I think, in the developing world. If plastic is falling out in the atmosphere in London, as Wright et al. Found in her 2019 study, imagine what it looks like in Delhi, India, next to the landfill, right, where they have the dairy cows. So speaking of environmental justice, in the film, one of the journalists, Zoe Carpenter, I think her name was, she talks about how she finds a lot of attention paid to the waste side of plastics and less is paid to the production side. And I think this is very telling because plastic production is kind of concentrated in some discrete areas of the world, often around marginalized and disenfranchised communities, where pollution from those industries can, to some degree, be hidden away from consumers. So pollution generated during the product's development is not evenly distributed. But research in the last decade has shown that post-consumer plastic pollution in the form of microplastics is global. Now, again, I still think that exposure is going to be a lot higher in communities that live adjacent to landfills and incinerators and some of the recycling operations that were highlighted in the film. But in a way, microplastics have garnered a lot of international attention because it's sort of an inescapable, in that the exposure can't be zero, you know, even if you exist in a place where, you know, independent of your income level or geography. I have one more thought about income level and lifestyle vis-a-vis a plastic packaging. I think it's kind of genius that the plastics industry has figured out how to get everyone hooked on their products independent of their income level. In the US, time is money, or at least people say that. And so if you have a lot of the latter, you can buy the former by getting, for example, your fruits and vegetables pre-cut, like this picture in the upper part of the slide. You don't even have to wash the disposable container afterwards. You can just toss it out. So what's being sold in this picture is more than just oranges and cantaloupe. It's convenience, right? And then the three photos on the bottom were actually pictures that I took when I lived in China. I lived there in 1988, and then I lived there again in 2004. And this kind of open market that you see here with, you know, grains and beans and vegetables and pickled vegetables was pretty much all that was available when I was there in '88. But a lot of that is giving way to international grocery chains now. Carrefour, which is a French store, Justco is a Japanese store, and then they had a Walmart in Qingdao where I lived, which would offer a lot of pre-made, prepackaged foods like the photo above, like what we're kind of accustomed to. And many young Chinese preferred to shop in these, they call them department stores, because it felt modern. And if you have a little extra money, that's kind of how they like to spend it. On the flip side, in the Philippines, the sachets contained brand name soaps or lotion, and the people there don't have enough money to buy an entire bottle of the soap or lotion, so they just get a single serving of it because the alternative is, I suppose, just a wash without soap. Every year I share an old NPR article with my students that talks about sachets in the Philippines. And even though I think it really clearly explains the circumstances of these residents, sometimes people just kind of look at the pictures and they just think that these people are just being lazy, or they're just not, they don't care about their surrounding, when that isn't the case at all, of course, as we know. Sometimes, depending on my mood, I might ask them to look up Ulf Schneider's net worth. He's the CEO of Nestle, like $30 billion or something. So, I mean, is there potentially a relationship between his wealth and the company's wealth and the fact that they don't have to pay for the environmental harm of their products? Possibly. I did some work with it in consumer products and testing of consumer products. One publication that I have looked at salt and beer and tap water. And I've also just tested home water filters, filtration systems, toothbrushes, ice cube trays, water bottles, our bottled water rather, while we were kind of perfecting our sample processing techniques. And then this is, but as I said, my dissertation work involves the freight and transport. of plastics, as well as developing a sample processing method that will yield an accurate and descriptive physical and chemical profile of contaminant particles. And this method will be used in urban air samples, wastewater, and seawater samples from the Canadian High Arctic. So just to give you an idea of what we're finding in the Arctic, this is actually on the image on the right is kind of indicates there was an expedition in 2021 that was put on by the Northern Contaminants Program and ArcticNet. And they wanted to do some microplastic sampling, so you can kind of see the breadth of geography that we got samples from. And on the right-hand side, this is a filter that has been processed, and I use a particular stain so that the suspected polymers will glow, and so you can kind of see some of the fibers, you know, the shorter cylindrical fibers, and some of the long, kind of more gossamer fibers, and tons of fragments on here. In any case, I've read papers about particles in the Arctic before, and I know that they're there, but it's still a little bit shocking when you actually look at it through the microscope. And it doesn't take much to shock me anymore, but I would still, that was hard. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna find out what types of plastic, after we characterize them by shape and size, we're gonna find out the types of plastic, and we're also gonna look at total mass based on plastic type. And that last metric, mass, is really important because, as they say in the film, plastics don't mineralize and turn into something that nature can use. They just turn into smaller bits of plastic. So over time, they're going to degrade. And as they do, they'll increase in quantity and decrease in size. And for this reason, we need to measure mass. Because if you're just basing it on particle count, that's not really the only metric you should use. Unfortunately, it's not a metric that's used a lot in the literature, because in order to get this, you have to essentially vaporize your sample. And kind of understandably, like, researchers don't necessarily want to do that, but we're planning on putting that at the end of an analytical pipeline that we're working on. So another reason why it's important to report mass, at the 2022 CTAC conference, so this was actually just last November, the Society of Environmental Toxicology and Chemistry conference, there was a presenter from California, and she specializes in risk assessment, and she was walking us through this hypothetical risk assessment that involved, I think, foxes in California and microplastics. And essentially, she was just showing us that you have to have mass, and without it, you can't calculate risk assessment. You can't calculate things like threshold limit value. These are kinds of values that you use for occupational exposure. So just as an example, if you're doing dose response assessment for lead in human blood, it's 10 micrograms per deciliter of blood. So you need to have that microgram, you have to have that mass. And the threshold limit value for phthalate, which is a plasticizer, is something like 5 milligrams per cubic meter if you were working in a place where you could potentially inhale it, right? So this is just an important metric. This headline here is a quote from a food packaging forum. It's a science communication organization in Switzerland. And it kind of just shows highlights another challenge. There's high uncertainty exists because researchers are using different methods for detection, and they're using different metrics for reporting, as I mentioned. There isn't really a universally agreed upon way to isolate samples from media like air or water or soil. And the scientists aren't trying to produce work that is really difficult to compare. It's just the nature of this type of research. So the challenge is that microplastics, well, I should just say plastics, are extremely heterogeneous. There's so many different varieties. I took a class from a professor who's a 3M chemist at, well, he's a chemist at 3M, polymer chemist. And he said there's over 1,000 different types of plastic. And according to Plastic Europe, which is a trade organization, about 70% of the plastics fall into the 6 categories that we're probably familiar with, right? The PET, HDPE, PVC, LDPE, polypropylene, polystyrene, right? So these are the abbreviations you would see on the bottom of your containers. But that means the remaining 30% are all these other plastics. Some of them are known as boutique plastics, and they're designed for a very specific application. So if someone were to ask you how many varieties are there, it's like saying, well, how many different type of apple varieties are there in the world? You know, if you went to Kazakhstan, there's just, it seems limitless, you know, or like how many different types of way can you bake bread? You know, if you change one little thing, it almost seems like there's an infinite variety. And it's kind of a good way to think about plastics. So this makes environmental testing really difficult because we're not just looking for a single thing. We're really looking for a thing that has a multitude of faces. And then you take into consideration the fact that there's all these different types, and then you have to multiply it by the fact that there's all these different ways that they can break down in the environment and all these different unique circumstances, you know, different salinity, temperature, pH, all those things. And it just makes it very complex. So that's just something to, these are just some of the challenges when I'm thinking about this, kind of like, how can we develop policy around an issue when we have to deal with these challenges? However, there are three discrete areas of concern when it comes to human health. The first is that many plastics have additives like antioxidants, flame retardants, anti-statics, biocides, UV stabilizers, and these things can leach into their surrounding as they break down. And then a second problem is that compounds in the environment, maybe like PCBs, DDT, heavy metals, pathogenic bacteria, are attracted to the surface of the plastics, so they can concentrate there. And then the third problem is that obviously they're very small, maybe even nano-sized particles, which means they have the ability to move through living systems in a way that larger particles just can't access. So while a particle would have to be less than 100 nanometers to pass through your dermal barrier, which is maybe like the size of a virus, fibers have been found between 8 and 16 micrometers found in human lung tissue, and in breast milk recently they were found, and they're like 2 to 12 micrometers. So speaking of which, just kind of highlighted here some of the studies that involve human health, or I guess like well, these studies don't explicitly talk about the effects that they're going to have, just the presence in human bodies. So as far as the human body goes, there are pilot studies that involve human stool samples. This graph here on the upper right shows the 22 volunteer donors that supplied blood. And I don't know if you noticed this, but on the y-axis, they have micrograms per milliliter, right? So they were using pyrolysis GCMS to get mass. And then below that, we have, I think it's polystyrene that was found in some lung tissue. On the right, the little pink bead there is, I gotta reduce this. The little pink bead came from placenta, human placenta. And then below that, the polypropylene fragment is from breast milk. An interesting finding in the breast milk study is that they had participants take a survey of, they took their age, personal care products they use, consumption of fish and shellfish, since that's a known route of exposure of ingestion, and then beverages that were consumed in plastic bottles and food that was in plastic packaging. And they found no correlation between that and the levels found in breast milk. So this is important because it really indicates that even if you try and control for these things as an individual, you're pretty much still going to be exposed to it, which means that in order to solve this problem, we need some sort of collective action. So I want to end this quick presentation by kind of going back to the global health consequences. This nicely shows, this example shows that even after we think that we're getting rid of plastic, the harm just keeps reverberating through the food chain. So this study came out last year, and here they found that dioxins and PCBs were discovered in 90% of eggs that were laid by free-range chickens mostly they were in developing nations. They found 88% of them, of the eggs sampled, had exceeded EU regulations for these two chemical families in excess of 14%. Oh, I'm sorry, in excess of 10 times. There were 10 times, oh, I'm sorry. 88% of the eggs were greater than the EU regulatory limits. 14% were 10 times the EU regulatory limits. And the highest amount was actually found in eggs that were from Ghana, and they were produced near an e-waste site where electronic waste is e-waste, right? A lot of this stuff gets shipped out of the United States because we haven't signed the Basel Convention. And so it's still legal for us to do this. And in order to get the precious metals, kind of the tiny little bits of precious metals, a lot of times these electronics are burned. So the plastics in them are burned. And it had 264 times the EU limit for dioxin. So a child eating an egg from this site would be exposed to more dioxin than is tolerable for them in a 5-year period. So it's really poisonous stuff. They also found high contamination at sites that burned plastic. There were 3 sites in Kenya that had high contamination in eggs near e-waste sites. And there was a tofu factory, I think in Indonesia, that used plastic as fuel. In Java, there were chickens that were eating ash from burned plastic waste. And burned plastic can release some 2,400 hazardous chemicals and greenhouse gases in many of these developing nations, where there are very few environmental controls. So on that dreadfully sad note, I guess I'll stop sharing. And yeah, maybe there's some good policy that Lucy will tell us about, or where there's hope where we can kind of get a handle on this.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mary. That was so interesting. Yeah, it's such a huge problem. It's kind of overwhelming, but we have to do what we can do to address it. So thank you so much. That was so interesting. Lucy, do you want to take control and share?
Sure, yeah.
Great.
Just 1 second. I'm sorry, it's bedtime in my house. I'm assuming only I can hear this, but hopefully it doesn't get too loud. Let's see, sorry, 1 second. There we go. And let me just switch this around. Okay, you guys see my slides?
Yep.
All right, great. Yeah, so thank you for having me. And thank you, Mary, that was great. My name is Lucy. I am the Director of Policy and Advocacy at Eureka Recycling. I just want to sort of begin by saying I'm fairly new to this issue. I have been all there almost a year, but it is like so complex that I feel like I'm just still like learning so much every day. But of course, if questions come up that I can't answer, like I can circle back. But what has been interesting is I have been in the policy world for a long time, and I was working against the big banks, and a lot of the same strategies that like the banks use to get around regulations are used by the American Chemical Council and others. So it's like strategy-wise, it's been interesting to compare. But anyways, I thought today that I would do kind of a deeper dive into the recyclers, the mission-based recyclers perspective. You heard Martin from the Ecology Center in Berkeley speak a little bit during the story of plastic. He's a colleague of ours. But I wanted to dive a little bit deeper into that perspective and then share some policy solutions that we're trying to work on. So there we go. So yeah, so Eureka Recycling is a mission-based recycler. Recycling has largely been bought up and consolidated by the waste industry in the United States, and their primary revenue source is landfilling and incineration. So they don't have an incentive to recycle. Whereas we, as one of only 4, we've come together to create a coalition called AMBER, the Alliance for Mission-Based Recycling in the US. And we are a social enterprise nonprofit recycler where we're really taking like our experience on the ground, or what we call our view from the pile, to inform the policy work that we're trying to do, to inform what types of system changes we see, when we see our stream and we see it being increasingly contaminated by plastic, what impact is that having, and what policy solutions can we have? So recycling, for recycling to make a difference, we needed to get back to the values that it was based on. So I just want to give some framing for when we talk about mission-based recycling, what that means. So for Eureka, it means good jobs across the industry. These are some of the most dangerous jobs: collecting and sorting waste. And throughout their industry, a lot of these jobs are temp workers. They're not benefited. At Eureka, we employ about 130 people. Our drivers are union drivers. We provide safe, sustaining jobs. We have people that have been in those positions for a long time, and that's really important because they are more experienced. We have very, very low sort of accident rates, things like that. We also really care about where we're sending our material, where we're sending our glass, aluminum, cardboard, paper, and the types of plastic we collect. So 80% of our feedstock stays here in Minnesota, 90% in the Greater Midwest, and 100% in North America. Responsible end markets means we know what's happening. We know that those materials are getting turned into something else, a quality feedstock. And then zero waste. We believe that a zero waste future is possible, and that recycling is not the end goal. It's not the only solution. It's just a way for us to, a tool for us to use as we transition to zero waste. And our goal is to really think about how are we keeping resources in the ground and moving towards reduction and reuse. And then all of this work is really informed by our partnerships with the environmental justice community, both here in Minnesota, but globally as well. We're members of the Break Free from Plastic movement. Lynn, one of our co-presidents, was just in Vietnam for the global meeting, learning a lot from waste pickers in the global South, and really informing just all of the work that we do. So it comes down to the fact that plastic packaging is trashing recycling. So what does it mean when we have plastic packaging that is not recyclable in the recycling stream? It increases hazards for workers. Plastic is highly flammable. We have a big issue, a safety issue with plastic bags. We spend about $85,000 a year, $85,000 a year. We shut down our equipment for 4 hours a day, every day, just to cut out plastic bags. That's a really dangerous thing for our employees to do, but that's just plastic bags alone. It also increases the cost of recycling services for cities and then for residents to try to clean up our stream. And unfortunately, we can't clean up everything. So we have more contaminated bales. That means stuff that actually, like our paper, for instance, our paper bales become more contaminated because we have things like mixed plastic pouches in our bales, or plastic film in our paper bales. So recycling can be an important tool from our perspective. Again, this is a recycler's perspective, but it's not the solution for everything. It's rarely a solution for plastic. Instead, recycling some plastic is a transition strategy, as I mentioned, to move to zero waste. So for example, PET bottles, those bottles are a great candidate for reuse. But we collect 500,000 PET bottles a day at our MRF in Minneapolis. If we are not recycling those bottles, they're being burned in the incinerator in North Minneapolis. So what we really as we try to transition to zero waste and build out an infrastructure for that, for reuse, we have to think about, okay, what can we recycle this type of plastic? And then even if we can, should we? So when we talk about can we recycle something, it means, can we collect it? Can we sort it? Is there a value for it? So is there, can we actually sell that, or are we just going to bale it up, and is it going to sit in our warehouse? And is there a responsible end market within our region? Sending it, across the globe is not a solution. Even sending it further from our region, like what's the environmental impact on that? So we want to be thinking about, okay, does it sort of check all of those boxes before we say, yes, we can accept this as recyclable. Right. And then even if we can't say we can accept something, should we? So like, what is the labor impact globally if we are accepting something as recyclable? What are the like environmental impacts? What are the environmental justice impacts? Who's benefiting? Who's burdened? Is this actually keeping resources in the ground? Are we actually reducing extraction? Like if we started collecting PVC, that's not going to have any impact on extraction. And in fact, collecting any plastic, are we actually seeing a reduction in extraction? No, like we're just continuing to see more and more, and recycling is being used as like as something that industry says, oh, but well, you can recycle it, but the infrastructure is not in place to recycle it and to do it safely. Toxic, all plastic is toxic. So when you look at all the plastics, like there's going to be a toxic issue. But so then it's like, well, what is it more toxic for us to burn 500,000 PET bottles a day in Minneapolis now, or should we keep recycling that and build out a transition strategy? So it's grappling with that. So from our perspective, the candidates for MRF-based recycling only include a couple types of plastic. So recycling is not a viable or effective solution for the majority of single-use plastic packaging. And so I want to just like frame this by saying that any recycling advocacy should always include and be complemented by strong reduction requirements and non-toxic reuse strategies. So the few formats of single-use packaging that are candidates for recycling in a MRF-based residential system here in the US. Again, this is MRF-based recycling in the US. As we try to work towards moving away from plastic, would be PET bottles, HDPE, so like your milk jugs, and in some cases, in some places in the US, but not in most cases, number 5 plastic, which is polypropylene, which is like your yogurt containers, and a lot of that is really downcycled into other things like carpet. But so for these types of single-use plastic packaging, recycling them has the potential to be better than the immediate strategy of burning and burying. But in order to achieve that potential, we have to be pushing for increased plastic packaging any push for increasing the plastic packaging recycle for these ones has to include improved worker protection for both formal and informal sector, transparency and responsibility for human and environmental protection in the end market. So where is this being sent? And the elimination of toxic additives in all plastic packaging, because there's one thing that we are going to be studying this year with some of our partners at Safer States and others is like, what's the toxicity in recycled content? Because that's a huge issue. And then we do hold a line against false solutions. So there are some categories that are particularly low-hanging fruit for policy bans and other reduction strategies because they cannot and should not be recycled, or they're highly toxic, unnecessary, or they cause problems for other recyclables. And so this would include, plastic bags, really basically number 3 through 7 with the potential exception for number 5 in some regions. PVC is one of the most toxic plastics, and even a tiny amount of PVC can ruin a whole batch of recycled PET. So My role at Eureka is working on policy at the local, state, and federal level. And I just am going to run through these briefly and then happy to talk more about it during the discussion. But one thing that we try to advocate for is clear labeling standards for composting and recycling. Next session, we do hope to have in Minnesota, we do hope to have a truth in labeling bill for recycling. The chasing arrows is basically on everything. It means nothing at this point. And so trying to put in some standards around what is actually considered recyclable in Minnesota. We plan to be working on effective extended producer responsibility. So trying to build out a system where producers are paying for the life cycle of their products and packaging, and moving them away from plastic and non-recyclable, non-compostable, non-reusable materials to reuse and compost and recyclable products. We do work on efforts to eliminate single-use plastics. Happy to talk more about that. Investing in reuse and refill. We have a small bill that we've been working on this year in Minnesota that would provide a small grant program for small businesses, nonprofits, and local governments that are trying to build out reuse infrastructure and get over that startup hurdle. So say like a school district that is using disposable, plates every day, getting a grant to install dishwashers and buy reusable would be an example of the use of that grant. We support effective deposit return systems that have a strong strategy for building out reuse infrastructure. And then we also do a lot of trying to combat false solutions. So things around that the industry is pushing, including chemical recycling or advanced recycling. So I will stop sharing. I actually, before I do that, I do want to just point out, and I can put the link in the chat, but we did work with the same team that put out the story of plastic on a short 10-minute video called Chasing Arrows, the truth about recycling. I would encourage folks to look at it. It's a quick video and it's pretty good. Let me stop sharing.
Oh, thank you so much, Lucy. That was great. So much good information. And I have seen that Chasing Arrows video, so we'll have to get that out and share that with everybody who's signed up for this call too. So that was great information from both of you. Now we have time for questions. So if people want to raise their hand, ask some questions. Does anybody have one they want to start with?
There is, Lori, a question in the chat from Kate.
Okay.
And I'll go ahead. Where'd that go here? Let's see. And this was to Mary.
No, to Lucy.
Oh, to Lucy.
I can just ask her.
Go ahead, Kate.
So what I wrote is that lots of people think that all plastics can be recycled because of that little recycling symbol that's printed on everything.
Yeah.
And they throw all plastics into the recycling bin. So I'm wondering what your company is doing to reduce or eliminate this habit that people have.
Yeah, so we do try to do a lot of community education for the communities that we both collect and we sort recyclables for. And we do have a much lower residual rate than than the industry standard. So like the rate that we bring in that we can't actually recycle. So across the industry, that's about 20%. Ours is, it used to be a lot less, but with the plastic crisis, it's gone from like 8% to closer to 10. But anyways, I mean, it's a huge issue. If you come to our MRF and you can see kind of our pile, you can spot, things that have the chasing arrow on it that isn't recyclable. I mean, very easily. One of the big the problems is that, you see the resin code on there. I don't know what genius decided to make it a triangle that looks very similar to the chasing arrow. Sometimes it's actually the chasing arrow, but it's usually a triangle that just looks like a chasing arrow. So some states have like required that the resin be a triangle and that they can't use the chasing arrow. We have a problem with that because the triangle looks so similar to the chasing arrow. So the language we've drafted it basically just it just says that the chasing arrows can only be used for things that are deemed recyclable at the curbside recycling. And then we have a list of what can be, like what are the criteria for it to be considered recyclable. And we wrote it in a way to try to put it into the number 1 and number 2 category. We also put in a toxics piece. So even if, say, it was a number 1 plastic, but it had certain toxics in it, it would still not be considered. So I'm happy to send that draft language. It has a lot of work that needs to be done on it. But that's one thing. We also do a lot of federal work. So we just submitted our comments to the FTC is reviewing their green guides, which provides guidance to producers. It's not being super effective. It hasn't been updated for over 10 years. So we did we did provide a lot of comments around the kind of what is recyclable, how do you define the recyclability? And then the final thing is, if you really are confused, just for the general audience, if you really are confused about if you can recycle, on our website, we have a thing where you can type in, like, I typed in like strawberry clamshell, like my strawberry thing, and it'll tell you if you can recycle it or not. So if you are within our region, like you could, and you're wondering if like you're like, just say you live in Shoreview, which we collect for and we sort for, you could go in there and you'd be able to see if what you're putting in your recycling will actually get recycled at Eureka. And then the other thing, I mean, we spend a lot of money on. We have a lot of people working in the MRF we have our optical sorters that are trying to sort. We also have people that are like in there trying to pull things out. Like, I mean, so we're trying to like hit it on a lot of different levels, but it can't come down. Sorry, I'm talking a lot. It can't come down to the individual level. Like it shouldn't be put on people to figure out like, what is it that I can recycle or not? Like, this is producers greenwashing, and there has to be like a policy response to that.
Excellent. I think there's another question. Judy, you had a question. What, if anything, is expected to pass this legislative session to help with this problem?
It's a little hard to know. So, I mean, this session, I don't think anything will pass. I think next session is going to be a big year. There will likely be work on a bottle deposit program in Minnesota, which would do a lot to increase recycling rates. And we would like to see it also contribute to the reuse infrastructure. It's not going to move this year, but it was introduced. As this group probably knows, the EPR, there will likely be an EPR bill, extended producer responsibility, which ideally would put in a requirement for certain recyclability rates that producers have to meet a certain recyclability rate. And so in order to do that, they're going to need, labeling, they're going to need education. I think that's going to be a big battle about what that's actually going to look like. And I think collectively advocates need to come together to really work on that. Looking at Lori. And then I mentioned the truth in labeling bill, again, not this year. The only piece that we have this session that I can speak to, well, I can speak to a couple zero waste bills, things that are out there. Should I do that? Do you want me to go ahead, Lori?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so we have the zero waste grant bill, which I mentioned in the presentation, which would provide some funding for small businesses and nonprofits and small local governments to build out reuse infrastructure, but there is also some grants funding in there to fund electronics recycling and like fix-it clinics and recycling and composting infrastructure at the community level. So like a compost, just say you wanted to try to do community composting with your restaurants in the area or and get materials and something like that to do that. Then so that is in the House Omnibus Environment Bill, and they're going to be conferencing with the Senate next week likely. So we're fighting to get that included. Also in the House and the Senate Omnibus Bill, so something will likely be included is the cumulative impacts or frontline Community Protection Act, and that is, that's really looking at that's sort of a little bit outside of what we're talking about now, but it's basically looking at requiring the MPCA to look at the overburdened communities, like the collective impact that facilities are having before awarding a permit to a facility to basically pollute in that community. They have to look at what cumulatively is happening with pollution in that community before providing a permit on that. And then there is another zero waste language in the House bill that is creating a study to look at what counties need to do to actually move towards zero waste. I don't know if that's going to stay in or not. And then there has been a lot of work around PFAS this session in the House and the Senate bill. So where that lands, we'll see. But those are some of like the ones that we've been paying attention to.
Thanks, Lucy. That was a lot of good. Yeah, there's a lot of good bills either being worked on or in the works this year. Steve, did you have a question for Mary?
Yeah, Mary, you mentioned you're looking forward to once you finish your doctorate, your dream job would be in the global South. And watching that movie, the problem with plastic there just looks so overwhelming. What would be your role? What would you try to do to help the situation in the global South?
Yeah, well, I mean, who knows what will actually happen. I've kind of talked to some people about this, and probably one of the reasons why we have so many more exposure studies in the global north is just because people are willing to fund them. Time on the instruments that we need to do chemical analysis it's expensive. And so what I was kind of hoping to do is kind of work with communities that, just as an example, so in the Atacama Desert, I don't know if you've heard of this, but there's all these textile wastes that have ended up in the desert, and like tens of thousands of tons of this stuff. And I think there was some of it was intentionally incinerated just to kind of get rid of it, but of course no environmental controls. And so like people that live nearby, what kind of exposure just in plastics through the air, like what levels are we talking about? Another thought is in Cameroon, I believe they're taking, like, some of the rivers are just so clogged up with bottles that they collect them and they shred them. And I think in that particular instance, they actually send it abroad, and then they come back in these like building tiles for rooftops, right? And not to take away power from the people who are, turning literal waste into something that's useful. But I can't help but wonder if those, those tiles are still made out of plastic, and they're exposed to UV radiation and all kinds of weathering. What kind of degradation are they going to experience and expose community members to? So it's kind of things like that. We just don't, there are some studies on the continent of Africa. I'm looking at the map on my wall here because I put little dots in the places where, and there are some in Indonesia and Southeast Asia, but just not as many as we have here. I would just love to know and work with community members based on their concerns, but I don't know if I'll be able to get any funding or what kind of organization I'll work with. So we'll see. That's just a dream.
Let's see, we have another question. What got me in the movie is how a company built a pipeline to Scotland for plastic and it's still cheap. What can we do to pass bills to stop this kind of funding? Who wants to take that?
I mean, I don't know that much about this issue. I would say one thing I've found is that not that many legislators know about issues. Like they like EPR, I feel like is a perfect example. It's super complex and like you know, it can be dangerous with legislators working on stuff and not knowing like what it is that they are saying yes to or saying no to. So I would just say like with that or with any bill, you know, starting off by like, you know, educating your like legislators and knowing when you go into the room, you're probably going to know more about it than they do. And like feel good about that. But I feel like that's made me feel better being new to this issue and going into a meeting with the legislators like, well, I guess at least I know more than than they do. I have something to provide, you know. So, but I'm sorry, I can't speak to that specific one.
So I also see in the chat that somebody was in the Hennepin County Master Recycler and Composter course. There's also a Ramsey County Recycling Ambassadors program run through Ramsey County. Mariah Quick runs that. Lucy, do you work with what's your relationship with how the Ramsey County Recycling works?
Yeah, so I mean, we are I can't say for the county. We, as far as we do collect and sort for the city of St. Paul, and so we have a contract with the city of St. Paul, and then a couple of other smaller communities within Ramsey County. The work that we've done like directly with the county is more around sort of like educating their commissioners on the issue and having them out to our MRF for tours and some policy. They're part of a Ramsey, Washington, and Hennepin County work closely together on policy issues when it comes to waste. And so we work with that group and often actually don't agree or butt heads quite a bit, but yeah.
So yeah, if anybody is interested in the Ramsey County Recycling Program, it's called the Ramsey County Recycling Ambassadors. And it basically 1 hour a day, six sessions, and you get a lot of different information. And one of the things that struck me, I went through the course, is just how complex it all is. What is recyclable and what's not? You know, things like black plastic, right? Lucy?
The worst. Yeah.
You can't do it. You know, you're like I'm using Gatorade right now. It's a plastic bottle wrapped in film, right? Can't do that one either. People are throwing those in the recycle bin all the time. There's so many caveats on what is and is not recyclable for plastic, because as I think as Mary mentioned, 1,000 different types of plastic. And it's just too many. And that's a huge complexity issue when it comes to trying to do something with it post-consumer.
One hazard from that I'll say is that if you take the course, then your spouse is going to ask you all the time, can you recycle this? And yeah, so just know that.
And when in doubt, throw it out, right? Because it's way worse to have something that's not recyclable in there than it is to throw a couple of things that are recyclable into the regular trash.
And I had a question for you, Mary. I think you mentioned something about simplifying, standardizing plastic. What do you think are the chances that, and I've heard that mentioned by another researcher. What do you think the chances are of industry going for a more simplified, less toxic plastic, and finding a less toxic plastic and sharing that information with other plastic manufacturers?
I feel like they're probably only going to embrace that if they get some pressure to do it. I mean, I don't see why they would want to do it on their own. Because I feel like, from what I understand, when they're deciding, like, they have a product and they want to put it in some plastic packaging, there's like this whole list of things, and they have their priorities, like, what color is it? How flexible is it? How rigid, how long will it last? There's all these attributes that they can kind of shop from as far as the characteristics go. And I don't even know if recycling is, I kind of don't think that that's a really high priority often. But yeah, if we were to simplify things, because we even have like layers on layers, I think, from what I understand, and Lucy, you probably know this better than I do, but like, even just a regular Coke bottle, the label and the cap and the bottle itself those are like 3 different types of plastics, right? And then you could, separate them, but the work involved in that is probably not worth the material. So
yeah, I mean, like Stephen mentioned, like, the Gatorade bottle with a label, like, we accept it, and the label in the process, the label will get like separated. I don't know the science behind it. It does, but the fact that the label and that like is on there, it makes it more toxic. Like, there's like an added toxicity to it, and so that's why, like, getting the toxics out from the beginning is so important, because then every time you recycle, you're like, it's being degraded more and more, and it's like, it's just becoming more toxic. So, but the label is like there's like I know that from learning from Safer States, there's a lot of toxicity in that piece.
And then there's another question to Lucy about getting people to stop using plastic bags to collect recyclables. And it's one of those things I noticed too. I walk around my neighborhood on recycle day, and they got the yellow bins with their lids popped up. And there's always plastic bags in there. There's always plastic bags. And
yeah, I think this is like our biggest, I think people get really frustrated with Eureka, because if we see that there's plastic bags in your recycling bin, we will not take it. Like, it's dangerous for our workers. And I think people don't they get frustrated with us, but plastic bags, we try to, like I said, we spend 4 hours a day shutting down, like, I'm not exaggerating here, 4 hours a day shutting down equipment and then our workers have to climb into it, cut it out, the plastic bags. I mean, it's a reason, one of many reasons why recycling has become more expensive for cities. But yeah, if our drivers are trained, if they see, if it's maybe 1 or 2, they can pull out. But if it's a bunch of plastic bags, they're not going to take the bin. And what that probably sets us apart, because like someone like Waste Management, they'll just take it because they're going to send it to the incinerator. So it's, we're trying to like actually collect things that are actually recyclable. Yeah. Oh, but people can call, and like we'll tell them what the issue is, and this and they will say, we can if you want to put out like a box, a cardboard box, will take double next week. Like, if we have to miss your bin, we will offer that. Like, that is like, or like maybe we'll come around like on a following day. But like, I mean, that adds a lot. Like, it's a lot for us to come around twice in one day. So it's likely we'd say you'll be allowed to have an extra bin out that day if we miss you.
There's another question for Mary on, do you know if health professionals are getting involved in the issue of microplastics in health?
I just wrote a kind of a quick response just about like the 2 things that came to mind. If this is what you're thinking of, Kate, flexible tubing, there can be an exposure of phthalates that patients would inhale. In fact, I think in Mark Shapiro's book, Exposed, he I think he talked about how some of the healthcare professionals, when they learned about this, were trying to find alternatives. So that was really cool. I don't know how widespread that is, or if I don't really know if they've taken phthalates out of those things yet. But I also read a study about like joints that can have plastic components in them, and sometimes over time they'll wear down, and they found that some of the particles will actually migrate to lymph nodes, which is, yeah, I know. I read that. It was like 4 a.m, and then I think I just couldn't get back to sleep afterwards. I was like, I'm up. Oh, there was another thing I was thinking of though. Oh, I lost it though. Sorry, my brain's mush. But yeah, there's a little bit. There's a little bit.
All right, I think time for
Go ahead.
one last question. Is from Judy. For both Mary and Lucy, what's your advice to local city councils on the top actions that communities can take for plastic reduction or recycling?
I can jump in. I mean, I would say that, unfortunately, like, I feel like cities are not, they need to be, they're the one with the cost burden of this right now. And I think they need to be, I think city council should be more vocal about what's happening, like at the state level, removing the preemption on plastic bag bans that the state passed. Like, cities have their own state policy agenda, and they should be like putting some of this on. I think that there has been some ordinances passed around to-go boxes. I think, like, trying to eliminate the single use in the to-go boxes. Just with the pandemic, we saw like so many of those coming through. But there's a lot of good models out there for city ordinances on that. Honestly, I think if cities across the state came out and supported a bottle bill next year, that would be huge, because you're going to have like it's hard to imagine them doing this, but you're going to have the chamber against bottle bills because of the retail like portion on it. But it's a proven like way to effectively increase recycling rates. And we have our own sort of like take on what a bottle bill as a recycler needs to include and things like that. But I was sat in on the bottle bill hearing in Illinois today or yesterday. When was it? I don't remember. But all of these just chambers and all these cities actually in Illinois, you can like file, and they all filed in opposition, and it's just like really discouraging. So I think it can be powerful if cities actually put this on their state policy agenda, because they do have a powerful voice at the Capitol.
Well, yeah, I would love to see a bottle bill, and we should all ask our city officials to do that, raise our voice at the city level and to our state legislators too. So anyway, I want to just thank you both, Lucy and Mary, for spending your evening with us and really sharing so much really interesting information, and really appreciate you taking the time to join us tonight.
Thanks so much for having us.
Yeah, excellent information. Well, thank you everybody for joining us. And then I hope you can join us again May 31st when we have another presentation at the Shoreview Library at 6:30. So thank you everybody for coming.